This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. This season, we're partnering with Democracy Exchange, Canada's Democracy Summit, taking place April 16th to 18th in downtown Toronto. The summit tackles today's most urgent civic issues over 3 days of programming, including inspiring speakers, thought-provoking expert panels, and hands-on workshops. As a Progress Canada listener, you can save 20% off registration by using this code, Lightbulb at DXC26. Visit democracyexchange.org to register today. Today we're joined by Keith Currie, President of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for the invitation, Tricia. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit, before we get into the meat and potatoes of our conversation today, I want to talk a little bit about your background and then also the organization you represent, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. Can you talk a little bit about what the organization does and what you do as its president?
So the Canadian Federation of Agriculture represents 190,000 farmers and farm families and ranchers from coast to coast to coast here in Canada, and literally representing all of the agriculture that's in the country. Our membership is made up of all the provincial general farm organizations. So, for example, the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, which I represented for almost 20 years, is one of our members, and the majority of the commodity organizations are members as well. So we do represent agriculture right across the country, and we advocate on their behalf to both our federal government for better policy and better opportunities for agriculture, but we're also members of the World Farm Organization, and I actually sit on the board of directors of WFO, and so we also represent Canadian agriculture in the world picture as well. So that's not our primary focus. Certainly, it's here nationally in Canada. But we work with not just farmers, but we work with the entire value chain of agriculture, because the reality is, at the end of the day, if we're not successful, they're not, and vice versa. So we do work closely with the entire value chain as well.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think when people hear agriculture, they think like maybe canola farms and that's about it. Maybe a dairy farm thrown in there as well. But there are producers, the entire agri-food sector. What does that look like across the board?
So in Canada, we can grow just about anything. We cannot grow some of the citrus fruits like grapefruit and oranges and lemons, but pretty much everything else we can grow. So, and what people forget about is we also include seafood. Seafood is farming as well, and seafood is a big part of our agriculture as well. We also have our ornamental section, ornamental flowers. Myself, I do grow gladiolas, and I call them the guilty man flower for everybody out there. And that's a part of agriculture as well. And we do a lot of work with the landscape folks too, because grass is a product. So when you look across the country, we have different aspects of agriculture. In Ontario, where I'm from, certainly we're very blessed with good capital assets, good soil, good weather, humid climate, good growing conditions, and a large population to not only consume our products, but help further value added through the manufacturing sector here in Ontario. Certainly, when you go to Atlantic Canada, we think about potatoes. In Atlantic Canada, we think about the seafood aspect of it. We think about some fruits and vegetables out there, those kinds of things. Quebec and Ontario are probably, from a dollar perspective, 2/3 of the agriculture in the country. We're pretty broad and diverse in our agriculture in both those provinces. And then you go into Western Canada, Manitoba has, certainly you get into the grains and the oil seeds, the soybeans, the canola, and livestock as well in Manitoba. And then your real, the heart of the breadbasket, the prairies in Saskatchewan, and to a lesser extent Alberta, where a lot of our cereals are grown, and our pulses like peas are grown, and lentils, chickpeas and lentils, these kinds of things. And then we get over the Rockies into BC, where they're also quite diverse, although the land base is a little bit smaller. They are quite diverse in what they grow, lots of livestock. Their crops tend to be more of the horticulture variety, fruits and vegetables. There's also a pretty decent greenhouse sector out there, lots of flowers. So it's quite diverse because the climate's different, the soil's different, the people are different, the market access availabilities are different. But it is quite diverse as you go right across the country and what we grow.
When I was at the Ministry of Agriculture in Ontario, pulses were an enormous part of the mix that people don't really think about. But we had been, I think one of the 1 to 2 top producers in the world and exporters of it as well. So I really take your point about how dramatically different what we have to offer is across the country, but also how much we have to offer from a global perspective, which I sort of want to turn to now. So, this year is the year of the deal, hopefully. We'll see. Back when I was at agriculture, there was a lot of international trade deals being landed. And I think what people underestimate is how important agriculture is to that conversation when it comes to trade. So much of our trade is based on agriculture and agri-food. And it was an enormous part of CUSMA, which was the deal that was negotiated between Canada, Mexico, and the US. And that deal is now up for review this year. So before we really get into that, I want to ask about how good or bad or neutral, I guess, has that deal been for Canadian farmers and agri-food producers over the current agreement? How have we fared under the current agreement?
Well, I think it's not just only good for agriculture and for farmers. I think it's good for our economy in general. We've had 30 years of a free trade agreement with the United States and Mexico, where, I mean, obviously the geographic location makes a lot of sense. Combine that with the population that we're serving to the U.S. in particular, but there's still another 280 million people in Mexico as well. There's a lot of mouths to feed, and having that geographic location access from a market standpoint has been excellent. But over those 30 years, our countries have got integrated very much in our trade, and certainly you would have seen that when you're with OMAFRA or OMAF, whichever it was called at that time. It'd be OMAFRA at that time, I guess. Where, as I mentioned earlier, Ontario is blessed with a large manufacturing sector, which is further value adding our products. And for the most part, a lot of our products, the value is in the value added. And Ontario is fortunate to have, within a 24-hour drive, 250 million people. That's a lot of people to feed. So that's why the industry got very integrated with products going back and forth, much like the former Minister of Agriculture, Jeff Leo, used to reference his Dodge Caravan, parts crossing the border 4, 5, 6 times before his van got in his laneway. Same thing is true with agricultural products. Before they actually get on the consumer table, they're back and forth. So that meant opportunities for our products to get elsewhere, and it also meant a big economic opportunity from a job standpoint and money flowing through the economy, which is why we are always continuing to say support agriculture, because it drives the economy. It's not only economic security, it's national security from a food security aspect. And it also, we grow a lot more than we can consume because we are a relatively small population given the size of our country. So we need those exports. So where we can ship products to easier, whether it's by port, whether it's by truck, whether it's by rail, just makes a lot of sense. And that's why the U.S. market in particular is so important to us. So we want to make sure that we don't forget about that market. But we also have to be careful, as we've seen in the last year, that we have a lot of our eggs in one basket. And when that basket gets upset, it can become troubling. So how do we continue to make sure that we maintain our largest trading partner, but maybe diversify a little more by increasing trade with other countries, including with Mexico, who's already within the current North American Free Trade Agreement. So it's very important to our economy. It's very important to farmers. We've heard a lot from our own government in particular about the importance of the auto sector, and there's turmoil going on in it all the time. We hear a lot about aluminum, steel. We hear a lot about forestry. We hear a lot about the energy sector. So for your audience who probably doesn't understand this, our canola industry all by itself in Canada is larger than the automobile sector. And when you take autos and oil and gas and forestry and aluminum steel and combine their GDP, it almost equals agriculture. almost. And when it comes to employment, combine those four industries together, they're about a third the employment that agriculture is, because we are by far the largest manufacturing sector. So I'm not saying ignore those other industries. They're very important to our economy and they feed a lot of people. But let's not forget about the potential opportunity to have in agriculture when we can really drive the industry forward and lock in on a healthy, good free trade agreement, especially with our closest neighbor, because it's going to be a win-win for everybody.
That actually pivots very nicely to my next question, which I always appreciate. When we talk about trade, it is always, steel, aluminum, softwood lumber, autos. We largely focus on that. If agriculture does get mentioned, it's usually the dairy industry. What kind of topics, agriculturally specific topics, are you expecting to come onto the negotiating table as this trade deal is renegotiated or not? We'll see. We'll see where it ends up. But what kind of topics should Canadians expect to come up from the agricultural sector?
Well, it's interesting. I just got back last week. I was in Anaheim, California at the American Farm Bureau Federation annual convention. And certainly we work very closely with that organization along with our Mexican National Farm Organization counterparts because we're all farmers and we all want the same thing. But in talking with my colleagues south of the border, we're really trying to drill down onto, what is their president looking for in the next agreement. And really, from their perspective, it did come down to two things. The big thing is the automobile sector, and how does President Trump get more manufacturing in the U.S.? That's a big one. And the other one that you've heard in the news is dairy, of course, dairy access. And for most people, it's probably a little confusing who aren't in the agriculture industry or in the dairy industry what that looks like. And just for a little perspective, the U.S. has always probably sent 3 times the dollar value amount of products into Canada that we send into the US on an annual basis. But when the original agreement was set up some 30 years ago, and it has continued in the various renegotiations or reviews, there are what we call tariff rate quotas or TRQ allocations. And what that means is there's an amount of product you can ship back and forth, a certain amount of product you can ship back and forth tariff-free. You hear President Trump talking about this 283% tariff rate. Well, that actually is a rate that is applied to both countries if you over exceed the allowable limit. And in the history of the agreement, the U.S. has never reached the top of that limit. But really what they're looking for right now is not so much increasing the amount of product that they can send over tariff-free. It's more about the allocation of who has control of the TRQs. So for your listener, we have a supply management system in Canada, but it's not just the farmers under supply management system; it's also the processors. So the dairy farmers have quotas. The chicken and poultry producers have quota system where they can only produce so much, but they're guaranteed a cost of production in that production. But also the processors have a quota system too, so that they are under control how much they can actually process and sell. And that way we only produce as much milk and process as much milk or chicken or eggs or turkeys in this country as we consume. So we really don't have a lot of excess product to ship. There might be some byproducts that we could ship into the United States or elsewhere, but the U.S. would like more access to our allocation of how the products are allocated, which is probably geared more towards the processors than anything else. So where we're going to land on that's going to be up to the dairy industry to decide what or if they're willing to give anything up. My suspect is that they aren't, because in the last probably 10 years, supply management has given up almost 15% increased access to our market. And they look at it like a death by 1,000 cuts. And the supply management system, I know it's come under a lot of scrutiny, but it's really been a fantastic system for our country, for our producers. It's meant a stable pricing for our consumers. It's also meant high quality products for our consumers as well, and access to them. So that's going to be probably one of the sticking points in the negotiations coming up. We haven't heard that there's really a lot of other stuff that's on the table. I'm sure when they get behind closed doors, there'll be other things, but we're not hearing that they're they're big irritants. Yes, we can always improve the agreement, maybe get more access here, less access there. I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but we're not hearing a lot of other stuff at this point. So fingers crossed that the review happens and gets done fairly quickly, and we get it resolved, and we move on.
There's a couple of things I want to tease out there. I guess from a consumer perspective, one of them is labeling. Maybe you can explain a little bit. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about made in Canada in the last year and labels like that. How does a product, say it's a dairy product, say it's a powdered dairy product, this is the one I always think of in my head, a powdered dairy product from the US, does that get labeled in a product that gets shipped across to Canada and eaten by consumers here, or how does that work?
So there are different rules around product of Canada versus made in Canada. And they're a little confusing to consumers, because made in Canada doesn't necessarily mean it's a product of Canada. It's products that are assembled in the country. And in some cases, if the cost of the container that's made in Canada exceeds the products that are in it, it can be labeled as a product of Canada or made in Canada. And they're a little confusing in how those rules are all set up. And so I think we've been asking, and I think many people have been asking for some clear definitions of what that product of Canada means. Some of the products that are made in Canada, in particular some of our canned items, require spices or other things that we just don't grow in Canada, so we need to bring stuff in. But essentially the base product is still a product of Canada, but might fall into the trap of not being called a product of Canada because it falls under the threshold of the amount of product that comes from Canada, and it probably falls into the made in Canada because it's put together here. So it can be a little confusing to consumers. Certainly product of Canada, for the most part, you can rest assured that there's Canadian product in it. Made in Canada, you probably do have Canadian product, but the opportunity to not have as much in it is much greater in the made in Canada aspect. And there are various thresholds, percentage thresholds of that particular item that will qualify for one or the other. And so really consumers still need to do their research and their homework on those products. And you know, I know especially in the last year, consumers have really been going over and above and looking for those product of Canada products. So we're kind of putting a bit of pressure on Health Canada to make sure that there's some clarity and some education for the consumer on what that actually means. And sorry, just to go further on that, you know, kudos to the province of Ontario. I think it's got to be 35 years ago now. People recognize, you know, the Ontario Foodland label. So things like that, the little blue cow on dairy products means it's a Canadian product. Those kinds of things are also very helpful for the consumer to understand where the product comes from. And you know, as an Ontarian, I always look for that green label wherever I can. And my dairy products, I'm certainly looking for the little blue cow on there. So I think that's really important from an education standpoint for your consumers.
It's actually, you know, as a communications person, it's incredible marketing that it really does resonate with people that much. They recognize it instantly. They want to buy it because of that. And it really is a huge success story that you don't often see in marketing trends in Canada. The other thing I wanted to talk about with this is pricing. So we're obviously in a bit of a cost of living crisis across the country. People are struggling with grocery bills. How does supply management and, you know, trade deals like this impact that conversation? Obviously, we want to support farmers and producers and make sure that they're earning a good living and can continue to do this work, because we have an issue as well with ensuring that people enter this type of industry. But there is the flip side of it, of making sure that consumers in this country can afford the goods that we're producing. What does that look like from your perspective right now in this conversation?
So one of the things I do, and I'm blessed being with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, I get to travel a lot, not only throughout the country, but really around the world. And the one thing I always try and do is whatever city I'm in, I always try an extra day ahead of what I'm doing or at the end to walk through the city, tour the city, but I also walk into grocery stores and I look at prices of products because I want to know how we compare price of products. And I haven't spent a lot of time in the U.S. on purpose in the last year, other than the business aspect of it. But I do, you know, I walked through some grocery stores in Anaheim last week, And our pricing is very comparable at the end of the day, and especially when you factor in the dollar difference. It is very comparable to US prices. And what supply management, for example, does is it controls the price, it stabilizes the price of a product. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's a cost of production built into the pricing formula to ensure that the producer is not going to be producing at a loss, because that's just bad business. And it also means that the processor has a quota on them and has a pricing formula built in, so that they too are going to make sure they're going to be have that cost of production built into what they do. The cost of production guarantee can't fix a bad manager on the farm. If you're a bad manager, you're probably not going to do well anyways. But at least assures that your average cost of production is going to be covered in the formula. And then what you do on the farm to create more efficiencies is what's going to determine whether it's a profit and a loss going forward. So it doesn't guarantee an automatic profit for the farmer, but it does also guarantee that stabilized income, and it guarantees that stabilized pricing for consumers. Now, what's factored into that for supply management is any advertising that's done on their behalf, any trucking that's done on their behalf. That kind of stuff's all figured in the cost of production from the consumer standpoint. So that's why you're seeing basically stabilized pricing for your butter and your eggs and your milk products. And they don't fluctuate up and down. Do they have door crashes like they do in the US with milk products? No, they don't. But if you look at the year-over-year cost of products between the two countries, we're relatively the same. And on the bigger picture of food in general, there's a lot of factors that go into pricing of food. Some of it, obviously, like we're seeing in the beef industry right now, supply and demand has a big factor on that. But unfortunately, it's not the farmer that's seeing those increases in prices. And what people have to realize is, once it leaves the farm gate, we don't have any control over the pricing. But if you think about that, the travels of the food product beyond the farm gate, the truckers have to be paid. They have to make a living. They can't truck for free, or they can't truck at a loss. If it goes for processing, that business that's doing the processing has to make money, and those workers in that building have to make money. Then it goes maybe to a wholesaler, and then to a retailer. So there's the whole value chain that has to be included in making money along the way. And these are businesses that are in it for profit. They're not in it for loss. So that has a factor on the price of food all along. And I think what we're seeing, or why it's more impactful now for consumers, have prices increased? Yes, they have. But I think what the big difference is right now is our disposable income has decreased significantly, especially with interest rates going up, housing, all your costs are going up on your life products. So that's now squeezing people to make decisions on their budgets and where do I cut? And we're about to release in another 2-3 weeks our annual Food Freedom Day press release. And Food Freedom Day is the day that the average Canadian has made enough money to pay for their groceries for the entire year. Now, if you think about that from a tax standpoint, it's generally around July 1st. You've made enough money to pay for your taxes for the entire year. Food Freedom Day is typically around the February the 8th or 9th or 10th, somewhere in that area. About 6 weeks into the year, the average Canadian's made enough money to buy their groceries for the entire year. That's pretty spectacular when you think about it, because you have to buy groceries for every day. You're eating every day. So, when we look at that aspect of it, you're spending about 10 to 11% of your annual income on food. And food's a pretty significant thing in people's lives. It's a pretty significant purchase. So when you're only spending 10 or 11% of your total income on food, I think we're doing pretty good that way. Now, having said that, I understand that people are squeezed financially. And so how do we figure out how to continue to make sure that our farmers are profitable so they continue to grow that good food that we have in the country? How do we make sure that the value chain is successful? Because that value chain, in Ontario, I think there's somewhere around 450 or 500,000 people working in the manufacturing sector of food. That's a big employer for the province of Ontario. So there's that aspect, the economic aspect of it, we got to keep in mind as well. So how do we get those food prices down? Or how do we generate more money for people to keep in their pocket? How do we get the economy flowing better? And that's where, like you did when you were in government, that's how the people in government got to figure out how do we do that? Can we lower taxes? Can we increase the economic output so we don't have to tax as much, or we can give more incentives back? How do we do that? And I think it's going to take the collective us to get together with our heads to figure out how do we make this better.
I wasn't originally planning to bring this up, but the premier of Manitoba, I think just a few weeks ago, had announced that he was going to freeze the price of a carton of milk. And there's an NDP leadership race going on right now, and one of the suggestions has been about government-run grocery stores, which is obviously an idea that has come from the U.S. What kind of impact would that have, and do you think that's less a thing of impacting earnings for the producers and more a thing of government probably subsidizing the cost of those groceries in that case?
Well, it can be a little bit of a slippery slope. I heard Premier Canoe make that proclamation, and good on him for making the effort. When it comes to supply and managed products, it might be more challenging to do that than he realizes, unless he's worked out an agreement with the Manitoba milk producers, the provincial organization, to somehow stabilize the pricing. But the pricing's already stabilized for the most part, so it may be easier to do than what I'm thinking it will be. The danger with other products, with non-supply managed products, and trying to put a freeze on them, and you just heard McDonald's come out, I think this week, and said they're going to hold prices on their value meals at the same for a year. That's great for the consumer. The problem with that is we're the only part of the value chain that can't pass on increased costs to our consumer. So when the price of a product goes up, let's say the price of labor minimum wage goes up anywhere in Canada, goes up 50 cents an hour. What do all the businesses do? They put another nickel on every product they sell to offset the increase in the wages. As a farmer, I'm a price taker, not a price setter. I cannot pass that cost on to the consumer. And also what happens when there's a potential freeze put on the price of a product, the retailers and the processors and the wholesalers are still going to make their profit, and they're going to push that cost down the chain to the farmer. So that becomes problematic from a production standpoint. And right now in agriculture, margins are very, very tight, very tight. Input costs are way up to the roof. Interest rates are up. Our commodity prices are almost, in some cases, at historic lows. So passing that cost down to the farmer, who can't recoup it in any way, we can't recoup it to the consumer unless we're selling direct to the consumer. That can be very problematic for the primary production business of agriculture. So depending on how he lays this all out, it could be potentially a good thing, but it could be a little slippery slope for the producers in this province if that cost is shoved down onto them.
So I have tons of questions about the broader ag sector, but I do want to bring it back to trade for a little bit here. So one of the big pieces of the trade deal that I think your organization and its member organizations, and then also your counterparts in the US, have been talking about, is ensuring the longevity of the next negotiated deal should it happen. And the push is for a 16-year renewal, but of course it could be less than that. It could not happen at all as well. So it seems obvious to me, but for the sake of our listeners, why is long-term certainty in the trade rules that apply to agriculture and other sectors so important going forward?
So agriculture is made up of small business owners. Farmers are small business owners. Now, we say small business, but we're talking about multi-million-dollar operations now. You look at the cost of machinery. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars worth of equipment on our farm. We're talking about our land assets, our buildings, all that kind of stuff. So it's a lot of money invested into a small business. So as a small business owner, what I want to know is I have some stability in my market. I have some stability to be able to make planning decisions going forward on where I'm going to invest, what my business is going to look like. And I think most small businesses, doesn't matter what kind of business it is, you like to see that long-term stability. So by asking for them to renew this till the end of the original agreement, which is 2041, that will give us another, at least 16 years of stability that farmers can confidently go forward and make that investment into their business, whatever kind of business it is. It also adds some stability from a supply standpoint. And that's big for consumers. They're going to know that the supply of the products that they want to buy every day is still going to be there. I'm going to go to my local store and I'm going to find it on the shelf because we have an agreement, a free trade agreement in place that's going to allow that product to flow into my country, whether it's food or other products. It stabilizes, when you look at the forestry sector, a large part of the U.S. is built on Canadian softwood lumber. So that's going to help supply a more stable pricing, hopefully pricing of housing going forward, for example, or the steel sector in all the things we use steel for, aluminum, all that kind of stuff. It just brings stability of a market and a stability of investment on the ground of the people producing whatever they're producing. So that's why we're looking for that long-term commitment, because it will also stabilize for agriculture. And what most people don't realize, when I talked earlier about we're price takers, not price setters. For most of our products, it's based on a Chicago Board of Trade pricing. That's where majority of products are traded. Our grain products, for the most part, and a lot of our oilseed products are traded through the Chicago Board of Trade. So whatever that pricing is what we get, so to speak. And a long-term agreement will create calm in that trading market, so you don't see big spikes up or down, especially down on commodity prices if it's all over the map. So it just creates a lot of stability going forward from a business aspect.
So the other thing that creates stability in these deals is dispute resolution management. So having enforceable mechanisms in your agreement that actually allow the partners to work out differences that come up over the course of the term of that. This has been something that has been built into all the free trade agreements in North America for the last, 35 years or so. And it's also always a major sticking point in all of the negotiations, because it is the thing that will settle disputes going forward. And again, it becomes a legal mechanism. It's not just, hey, this would be nice if you actually followed the rules. This is, hey, this is your legal obligation under the law that we've all agreed to, and there are penalties for not following that. So, we hear about softwood lumber dispute, like those words always go together. That's an issue that comes up often, but there are other areas where these disputes come up. How important is getting that dispute resolution mechanism right in this renegotiation of the, how important is that for agriculture and just sectors across the economy?
Well, it's incredibly important because it's law enforcement of the rules. And the U.S. has challenged us many times on many different products, and I'm not sure that we've lost any of the challenges. But the dispute resolution mechanism that's built within our current free trade agreement is an excellent one. It's really good. Can it be better? Sure. We can always, after having had it in place for 30 years, let's take a look at it. Do we need to change it, upgrade it, whatever, modernize it into 2026 and beyond? Absolutely. But in principle, the dispute resolution mechanism is working extremely well. We've been challenged on milk and other products in agriculture and been successful in defending those challenges. I know we've been successful in the softwood lumber challenges as well, because there's rules that you have to follow, and if you break the rules, you're going to get caught. And right now I think Canada has around 51 trade deals around the world. And we're dealing right now in a time where the appellate body, which is the dispute body for the World Trade Organization, WTO, is not functioning because they don't have enough members to be able to rule on things. And as a result, there's a little bit of chaos in the trading world. There's a lot of non-tariff barriers that countries are imposing to be protectionists for their own people. We see it in agriculture all the time. There's a bug in the grain, or the Italians are doing a great job of keeping our durum wheat out of Italy because they're trying to preserve and protect their own producers. And they're, these, I'll call them bogus, but they make up things that are non-tariff barriers that don't allow our products in. And right now there's no body that can come in and effectively rule and say, no, this party A, you're wrong, or party B, you're wrong. So you have to accept the product. The North American Free Trade Agreement has a great resolution process in it. So I'm hopeful that our government maintains the structure of that dispute resolution process, because it really is functioning well, and hopefully we can keep that in place going forward.
So just to wrap up this section of our conversation, if you had one piece of overarching advice of what the Canadian delegation must do in these trade negotiations, what would that be on behalf of agriculture and agri-food?
Keep the agreement as is and sign it for 16 years. There may be some irritants that we don't know about exactly, that need to be dealt with, and hopefully the government does, if it's a particular commodity, that they bounce those irritants off the commodities and say, hey, here's what we're thinking, but where's our wiggle room? What can we do to solve this? That kind of stuff. And the government, I'm sure, will be pretty good at doing that. But effectively, it's been a great agreement. So as I said earlier, if we need to upgrade it, if we need to make it better, sure, let's do that. Let's modernize it, but let's be careful. And I tell people all the time, and even if it's bad for a commodity or another commodity, a lesser worse deal is better than no deal. If we have no deal, it's chaos. It's utterly chaos, and the U.S. will flood our markets, and it'll be a mess. So go into it with strength. And I think the fact that Prime Minister Carney has been recently just securing a reduction in tariffs with China on products going in there, and he's been traveling throughout Asia and Middle East and Europe to try and find ways to expand markets. They've done a concerted effort in trying to expand even within countries like Mexico. I think it sent a signal to the U.S. that we want to work with you, but we're getting ready in case you don't want to work with us. And I think at the end of the day, the business sector will prevail in North America, because the business sector is in all of our government's ears saying, please don't screw this up. This is too important for all of us. It means too much to our economy. And also the other aspect to this, I think, where both Mexico and Canada might have a little bit of leverage with President Trump, is that we're starting to see a little bit more regionalism around the world. So you've got Russia sort of over one sector, you've got China, who's a force. And I think President Trump's looking at the Western Hemisphere and saying, maybe we need to be a region too, to make sure that we're covered with all the products we need, whether it's agriculture or other products, because the Western Hemisphere is asset rich as well. So I think there's an opportunity for Canada to maybe leverage that thinking into making sure that we secure a similar type of agreement that we have, so we can go forward and make sure we don't hurt all of our economies.
So I want to bring it back into the national focus now, because we have a lot of conversations going on internally about our production in this country too. So it's pretty well known at this point that the Prime Minister has a fairly ambitious national agenda in terms of infrastructure and shoring up the economy through this sort of Build Canada lens. Some of the concerns that have been brought up about that in response to Bill C-5 is what that means for Indigenous land rights and what that means for environmental protection. But the CFA has brought up a really, really important piece of that conversation, which I don't think people are talking about enough, which is protecting prime agricultural land. And that is something that, we talked about that all the time in Ontario with the Greenbelt. Once you lose that land, you can't get it back, because there's a reason why it is so good and so fertile, is because it hasn't been touched. Can you talk about why that is so important, and your suggestion to put that as another piece of the Impact Assessment Act?
Yeah, and of course, Ontario just finally, after many years of working on it, finally pushed through the Ag Input Assessment. Just this last week, I guess it was, they announced it, which is great, and something that the Ontario Federation of Agriculture has been pushing for a lot of years, and we at CFA are pushing for an ag impact assessment on all the development that goes on. You're right, Teresa. I mean, in Ontario, for example, 70% of the Class 1 land in Canada is in Ontario, and it's primarily now, most of it's entombed under asphalt and cement around the GTA. But that's our best producing land, and once it's gone forever. So the aspect of thinking that we can never build on any more land is a little silly, because the one thing that agriculture wants is more people to work. And if we're going to bring people into work, they have to find somewhere to live. Really, what the ag impact assessment will do is put a assessment or value on the projects being proposed, and is there a different place or way we can do it. When it comes to growth, it really needs to be responsible growth. It can't just be sprawl. And so can we infill, can we redevelop areas? Are there sections of the province that we've missed developing for whatever reason? And the ag impact assessment will also take into the environmental aspects of environmental sensitive areas, conservation areas, because even though farmers may not think about it or talk about it, they also understand how important the natural heritage systems are to what we do in agriculture as well, whether that's pollinator habitat or wildlife habitat or water filtering, whatever the case may be. Those natural heritage systems are important to agriculture as well. So hopefully an ag impact assessment will help the governments of the day at whatever level who's looking at it to make the right decision on development going forward. The bulk of our good producing land is in the lower half of our country, which is also coincidentally where 90% of our population is. So there is always going to be conflict there on governments right across the country, including the federal government, are trying to build more houses. But we have to plan how we build more houses and the types of houses we build. Can we build up more than out? Can we get different types of housing out there that are more affordable while not encroaching on more productive farmland? Because once it's gone, it's gone. And, as I mentioned off the top, we're the big guys in the room when it comes to the economy. And for Canada to survive economically, we need to take opportunities to grow the businesses that are there forever and that are going to continue to help us grow our economy. So how do we work in harmony? And I think something like an ag impact assessment is a really key way to be part of that whole process of how we grow responsibly going forward, and not just grow for the sake of growing. Because we've seen through the 70s and 80s a lot of sprawl, and as much as we all loved Hazel McCallium, the famous mayor, she was pretty good at sprawl, and she really didn't help the cause that way. She got a lot of stuff done. She did a lot of great things, but there's too many municipal councils think that growing is the easy way to make money, and it's actually more expensive than they realize. So how do we use those AIAs and really grow responsibly to protect the assets that we need in agriculture to continue to feed the economy?
How much information is there out there already that can be leveraged? So if I'm, a random person who doesn't know much about this, I say, oh, they're trying to add a whole nother level of bureaucracy onto this, which is going to slow down housing, yada, yada, yada. But when I was at OMAFR, we were embarking on a big soil mapping strategy across the province so that we would know where the great agricultural land was and we could make use of it in that way. But this wasn't a new idea either. I remember being at a rare bookstore sale around the same time, and I found a map from, I think it was 1911. It was a soil mapping map of the Peterborough area. So of course we obviously framed that in the office, but this is one of these things, like these conversations have been going on for a long time. Is there already a lot of information out there that can be leveraged to make sure that this doesn't necessarily slow down, the process that we're trying to make across Canada?
So I think the most recent land mapping in Canada was done in 1935. So we're coming up on close to 100 years old. And, it was accurate in 1935, and I'm not sure how accurate it is today. There is certainly a lot of private sector mapping that's been done through the technology. We have GIS mapping in particular, LiDAR, these kinds of things. The use of drones has done a lot of work with how we farm in general and how we map things in general. But we really do need not only soil mapping, but a soil strategy, because not only is that important for production and agriculture, it's also going to prove to be in the long term valuable for how we go forward in dealing with all the changing climate that we're dealing with here in Canada, and more specifically, the more different weather patterns that we're seeing. Senator Rob Black, who I'm sure you're familiar with, who's been involved in Ontario agriculture for a lot of years before being appointed to the Senate, has a members bill going through the Senate right now that's going to have an ask of the Minister of Agriculture in Canada to develop a soil strategy. And I think we've been asking for something along those lines for a long time. And I really think when it's kind of a motherhood thing, and I don't see any real hiccups on it getting passed to the Senate and then through the House and getting royal assent. But I'm going to sit down with Senator Black at some point in time, just talking generalities on how this is going to be laid out. And I'll talk with Minister McDonald about it too, because it's going to take a combined effort of the provinces to be involved as well, because our soils are so different across the country and our climates are so different across the country. Our pressures are different across the country. So what are we looking to find out of this soil strategy and how it's going to be used going forward? And if I can just go off on a bit of a rant for a minute, we've been talking about climate change for a long time, and I was in Brazil at COP30 this year. I've been going to COPs for a while now, and we're finally getting I think, a really quiet, subtle change in conversation around all things climate change. It's been emissions for 30 years. And how do we reduce emissions? How do we penalize people for bad emissions? That part can't go away. But now there's a quiet conversation starting to happen about, it really comes down to soil, water, and air that's going to help us with the control of those emissions at the end of the day. And the single biggest private sector landowner, certainly in North America, but around the world, are the farmers, agriculture. So this is where a soil strategy can really have a long-term effect on soil health, soil crop production, reduction in emissions, helping to purify air better, helping to purify water better. And I think we just need that big picture framework on a soil strategy to go ahead. And it's also going to play an important role, that soil strategy, I'm hoping, plays an important role in what you brought up about development and how we go forward developing so that we can protect those assets that are going to protect society. The challenge will be getting municipal and provincial governments to buy into it, because when you work on a 4-year cycle or less, you want wins, right? You want wins. But that's where we need the right champions in the ministries of agriculture provincially, and in the ministers of environment provincially, and in the PO offices in our provinces to really understand the big picture long term. And I think regardless of the color of your party, that would be a hard thing not to buy into. And so the strategy's got to be right to protect the soil, because again, I'm not opposed to development. It's a necessary evil that we have to have. We just got to do it right. That's my long-winded way to get around to what you asked me about we have to grow responsibly.
What do Canadians need to know about the labor gap for farmers and processors, and what are some of the long-term solutions the sector needs in order to stay competitive and productive?
Well, we're not unlike most industries in the country in that we're short on labor. Right now in Canada, just on farm alone, we're looking at somewhere around 30,000 jobs going unfulfilled. That's just on the farm. Then when you throw in the value chain, in particular in the processing side and even the retail side, there's a big labor gap there. So where's that labor going to come from? We either got to start making more babies in Canada, or we have to bring in use immigration to fill that need. Now, fortunately, under the temporary foreign worker program, as you're probably well aware of, we have the seasonal ag worker program. And that's been a fantastic program that's about 65 years old, I think, where we bring in workers for us, whatever the season is, the growing season is on your farm. It might be a couple months, it might be 6 months, it might be 8 months, but it's not full-time. Whereas the temporary foreign worker program can be up to 4 years. And also the difference with the seasonal ag worker program is you can bring the same workers back year after year after year if they want to come back to your farm. And that's been such a blessing to our farmers, because I don't have to retrain a worker every single year. And we're looking in some cases where we're now in the third generation of the same family coming back to farms, which is fantastic because they're also of the quality of worker that not only do we not have to train them, we're making them managers of our farm, parts of our farm operation. And they love that. And in Canada, we bring in around 70,000 seasonal workers annually, and probably close to half of them, I would say, are coming into Ontario. Our production would not be nearly where it is without those workers. So it's an important part of the temporary foreign worker system. We also need a strong temporary foreign worker system, in particular, as I mentioned, in our processing side of things, but also in our retail side, and to a certain extent, our trucking, our transportation aspect. We need a strong immigration policy, and we did a pilot project with the federal government about either just before COVID or just right after COVID started. It was a pathway to permanent residency for temporary foreign workers, if they so choose to come here and work and then stay and become citizens. And it was very successful, but it ended, and we'd like to see that continued. The seasonal ag worker program is different because people don't want to come and live here. They want to come and work and then go home and make a better life for their families wherever they come from. And that's fine. We need those seasonal ag workers, and that's a bit of a perk for them to be able to do that. They get CPP, they get health benefits when they're here, all that kind of stuff. But we also need the permanent people coming to Canada to work to fill those gaps. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the last 6-8 months about the temporary foreign worker program. There were some mistakes made by the previous federal government in opening doors wide and saying, "Come on in, we're open for business," and dropping a lot of the screening process that we needed, because more often than not, you get the people you don't want, not the people you do want coming in. So we need to fix that. The one aspect of the temporary foreign worker program that has worked very well is the agriculture portion of it. Again, much like a free trade agreement, can it be better? Sure. Do we need to talk about how to make it stronger, making it better? Sure. But we're saying use the agriculture stream as an example for the other streams on how you can improve your systems so that we have a good, solid temporary foreign worker program that people want to come to Canada. And I think, when you look at what is happening politically, geopolitically around the world, in particular south of the border, and what our prime minister is doing now by traveling the world, I think he's opening the eyes to where Canada is and the strength of Canada. And hey, maybe I should think about a new opportunity in Canada for myself and my family to come there. So how do we make sure that temporary foreign worker program is as good as it can be, so that we protect the people coming in, but we also protect those of us that are still here and not screw up a good system. So it's a very important thing that we need to figure out how we can attract more workers into Canada. And part of that attraction is also going to be recognizing skills that people already have. As I travel to Ottawa a lot, I fly into the city and I jump in a cab and I'm talking to a doctor from Egypt that's driving a cab because he can't get his license certified here in Canada, right? And how many people want more doctors, or pick your profession. And so how do we create a system that analyzes their certification process for their profession in their other country and get them working in their field here that we desperately need?
So before we sort of wrap up, because I have taken so much of your time already, I do want to talk about the innovation piece. So obviously we know there's a lot of rapid change happening in the world. There's the geopolitical piece, but there's also climate, there's trade, there's rising input costs. There's a lot going on that is impacting agriculture specifically. But the CFA has been really focused on this idea of driving not just growth, but also innovation in the sector. So, that was in your budget submission in the past year. It's part of your comments on the free trade negotiations. And I think people don't necessarily understand what that means in terms of agriculture when it comes to innovation. So when I think about it, most people, I think they think technologically, they think of like these really advanced tractors that cost $1 million and can basically fly to space at this point. But there are other innovations as well. And I think of deep water shrimp farming in Lake Superior, for example. So what most people don't know, but this was one of my nerdy things that I was interested in when I was at OMAFRA, was this idea of deep water shrimp farming in Canada, because when you go to other countries, there are some ethical implications of how food is produced. And we know in the shrimp industry, particularly, there's a lot of forced labor involved in it when you get it from various countries in Asia. And this was a way that Canada could actually farm shrimp responsibly in our waters. And I thought it was a really, really interesting innovation. And the whole innovation largely was that our Great Lake is so cold that it mimics the temperatures of the ocean, and therefore you can grow shrimp and actually farm it here. And I thought that was a great example of it. And as we continue to see climate go the way it's going, see geopolitical forces go the way they're going, I almost think we should borrow something from the oil sector in Alberta. And, they talk about ethical oil. Well, ethical agriculture, Canada is, probably the home of that around the world. And that is a big piece of the innovation piece too, is staying competitive on ethics, on process, on technology. What does innovation in Canada's ag sector look like going forward? And how can politicians and voters help support that?
So that's a great question, Teresa. And innovation is what's going to set you apart. And when you're a small population with a big land base, getting innovative to get an advantage is a necessary evil. So the more that we can innovate going forward, and your shrimp example is a prime one. When we talk about innovation, technology is important. And when we talk about technology, people's heads go to hardware. A sensor, a robot, a fancy tractor, as you say. I mean, our tractors are more advanced than the planes flying around in the air. That is important as well. And we're encouraged by the recent federal budget in the infrastructure money announcements, because it's not just roads, bridges, and ports. It's communications, and it's all kinds of other infrastructure that we can tap into that money on. But I think we also need to innovate on other things, like genetics, like livestock genetics, crop protection product genetics, seed genetics. What sets us apart? How do we use our assets that we have here in Canada and develop those types of genetics and products in that regard that are going to find a market that nobody else has, or grow a product that nobody else has, so we can seize a market better. So how do we get into that kind of thing? Certainly, from an ethical standpoint, we have labor laws that are second to none here in this country. So our workers are protected. Are there bad pet owners? Are there bad parents? Are there bad farm employers? Sure there are. And overwhelmingly, we want to get rid of those bad employers, but we have those labor acts in place that are second to none in the world, that are also there to protect our employment force going forward, to hopefully help secure it and grow it going forward, because they can rely on coming work here in a safe environment. The other thing that we're going to see in all sectors, but certainly in agriculture, is where AI is going to take us going forward, and how well we embrace it and not be scared of it. Right now, people are using AI like ChatGPT. They're using like Google, and that's not the power of AI. It's so much more than that. It's been around for a while, but it's going to grow our industry like we have never seen before, in the speed we've never seen before. And getting back to the ethical part of it, what I forgot to mention is, there's a lot of pressure on us around animal husbandry. And I don't think most people in this country understand that we have a national codes of practice council that sets out the codes of practice for all of our animals. And it's not just farmers that are on the board. It's not just government that's on that board. It's not just the Veterinary Association. It's the entire value chain of agriculture, the retailers, the processors, the truckers. But also on there are groups like the World Wildlife Federation. Many different activist groups sit around that table to have input on how we look after the things that we look after. And so those codes of practice are set out, and are, to their credit, our commodity organizations are enforcing those codes on their producers, to the point where they can shut you down if you don't follow the codes of practice that are set out. So really, from an ethical standpoint, Canada's doing great. We can always do more, but I think when you look at those technological advancements I talked about and what AI can do for us going forward, and you combine that with a potential soil strategy and a potential solving of the review of CUSMA or USMCA or TMAC, depending on the country you're in, and improving our geopolitical situation. But it's going to require some investment, whether that's the right regulatory framework or whether that's some seed money to get stuff off the ground. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of little nuggets in the recent federal budget from an infrastructure standpoint. And I think communications will be the big one, because in rural Canada, we're sorely lacking in our communications, whether that's broadband, more specifically, cellular service. That's going to drive all this stuff. So if we can tap into some of that infrastructure investment, the world's our oyster, Teresa. We'll just take it and run.
I was going to say, just based on everything you've just said, I'm very excited about the future of
Me
agriculture
too.
in Canada.
Me too. Yeah. There's so much opportunity there, and we just need people to give us the roadmap and then get out of the way.
Excellent. Always the case, right?
Always the case. Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I think this was a bit of a masterclass on Canadian agriculture, and I hope lots of people listen to it, because, despite having worked in the ministry, I learned a lot, and I think it's a really important topic for the future of our country. So I really appreciate you giving me this time today.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, because we don't get enough exposure, just so people understand a little bit more about agriculture and can appreciate the value of it in their lives, because everybody eats every day, and as a farmer, I thank people for eating every day, because they're helping the economy by helping me, and we really appreciate that very much.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.